The Torah portion to discuss this evening is called Vaetkhanan. It simply is the first word of the Torah portion, as is the case for most Torah portions. But this Torah portion in particular, I find, raises two large philosophical questions that have animated general philosophy, not only Jewish philosophy, for many centuries. The first of these questions is sometimes called the Euthyphro dilemma. There's a dialogue written by Plato, imagining Socrates talking with someone else named Euthyphro. This is around the time Socrates is being accused of corrupting the minds of Athens' youth by asking too many questions. Socrates always said, I don't know anything. You people know a lot of things. I don't know anything. And he just asked questions, and people realized how little they actually knew the more questions he asked. And Euthyphro is one of these as well, because he is convinced that he is doing the right thing. His father caught a servant of theirs who had killed someone else, tied up this murderous servant with chains, threw him in a ditch, and then forgot about him for 2 weeks. And in the end, that servant died. And so Euthyphro has now taken his father to turn him in to the authorities and is convinced that he is doing the right thing. And so Socrates, in his inimitable way, asks, how do you know that you are doing the right thing? How do you know that it's the right thing to turn in even your father when it was a murderous servant who wound up dying? Well, in the end, the question as Socrates poses it becomes a key one for the philosophy of religion ever since. Are things defined as good, or as Socrates puts it, pious? Are things defined as good because the gods love them? Or do the gods love these things because they are already good? What defines an action as good or evil? Is it because God says so? Or does God say so because it's already good or evil and God is agreeing with some kind of pre-existing category? Does God say, do not murder because murder is a bad thing and God is simply affirming that? Or is murder a bad thing simply because the God said, don't do that? And so the God gets to define what is good based on do and don't do. In some ways, this gets played out in modern ethics in the difference between consequentialist ethics and authoritarian ethics. If stealing has bad consequences for society, then cultures will say it's wrong. And they'll put the words into their God's mouth saying that it's wrong to steal because society won't support it. On the other hand, if worshiping idols and statues, or if plowing a field with two different kinds of animals at the same time is prohibited by the God, no matter how arbitrary it sounds to us, it is therefore immoral because the God said so. But if good is independent of God, then who needs God in the first place? As some atheists today would argue. As we see through this portion, this question of what makes it good, is it because the God said so, or is it because it is inherently good in and of itself and everyone knows it? That will play out through many of the pronouncements in our passage. The second big philosophical question we'll see play out is this distinction I mentioned earlier between what is legal and what is moral. Now we know, even from American history and the American experience, that sometimes what is legal is not moral. Slavery was legal. Jim Crow was officially legal with laws passed by legislatures, enforced by police and the justice system. Now we know that moral is also not limited to what is defined as legal. Sometimes moral has additional requirements, positive obligations beyond the negative limits of legality. Helping slaves escape, committing civil disobedience against unjust laws, those are moral actions, even if they are illegal. And sometimes positive duties that we consider moral go beyond what is required. It's encouraged, it's admirable, but it's not the bare minimum. For example, in the collection of rabbinic sayings called Pirkei Avot, there's a discussion of someone who says, the question of property and who owns what. So one person says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. That's the average person. One person says, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. This is the fool. Doesn't make any sense. One person says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. This is the wicked person. And then one person says, what's yours is yours and what's mine is yours. This is described as the saint. Now, you may have a different perspective on who is the saint and who is the fool, and who is, you might say the person giving everything away is a fool. You should keep it, everybody owns their own thing. It depends on your values of generosity versus private property. But clearly, the legal limit, the average, yours is yours, mine is mine, that's the minimum expectation. There may be a saintly level that's higher, but that's not required. That's not legal. We'll see this theme run through these first few chapters in Deuteronomy as well. So let me give you the setting for this Torah portion, and then we'll dive into the text. The setting is Moses is giving his farewell address just before the Israelites enter the promised land. And he provides a recap of their narrative of the Exodus, wandering through the desert for 40 years, and all the laws that were given to them over those 40 years wandering through the desert. Now, clever scholars, way before our century, have noticed there are some differences in those laws, and some of the repetitions are not exactly repetitions, they are reframings or reworkings of the laws that appeared in Exodus, Leviticus, or the book of Numbers. In fact, the word for Deuteronomy in Latin, which gives its name in English, is Deuteronomium, which is the second telling of the law. It's a repetition of the law. Where in Hebrew, the word is Devarim, which just means words. You could call any book that. So it's nothing distinctive about the title in Hebrew. But it is a repetition of the law in Moses's concluding speech. Now, we in Humanistic Judaism are also willing to ask who wrote this and when and why. Now, the historical background of the text is that it was most likely written centuries after this supposedly happened. Not during, let's say, the year 1200 BCE when Moses supposedly lived, but more like the year 700 or 650 BCE during the reign of King Josiah. And Josiah was particularly known for reforming the Jerusalem temple and eliminating all of the idols, all of the other gods that were worshipped, and only allowing the people to worship one God named Yahweh. This description appears in the second book of Kings, which we're not going to look at today. And we've also found archaeologically dated to the same time period during that 7th century, a trove of feminine fertility goddesses that have been intentionally broken in half and dumped into this garbage heap. So it seems to reflect both the time as described in the historical books and Kings and the archaeological record of a purgation of the fertility cult in this land of Judea ruled by the Judean kings. Now, this is taking place after the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed and deported from the land, and shortly before the Babylonian exile will happen, where Babylonia conquers Jerusalem, destroys the temple and the city, and exiles the elites to Babylon, where they will finalize the text of this new book they will bring back with them called the Torah. So one of the questions that we'll ask here is when these passages prophesy the destruction of the Hebrews for having worshipped idols, are they extrapolating from what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel? If it's being written, let's say, in 650 BCE, or are they learning from the experience of Judea, which was destroyed in 586? So they're writing it in 550 BCE or sometime after that. It's not really clear which destruction they're talking to, but clearly they're talking about the fear of exile and the theological question of how did this terrible thing happen? If our God is so powerful, why did we suffer and lose? This passage will try to answer those questions. And so what I'm going to do is pull up the text for you so you can all see it. I do have it in Hebrew and in English if you want to test your Hebrew, but don't feel the need to because we're going to be talking about the English text primarily. So again, it begins with Moses continuing his oration that begins in chapter 1, and he reminds the people that he interceded with Yahweh, the Hebrew God. The word Lord in all caps, by the way, in English is the Yud He Vav He name that you see in the Hebrew text that isn't translated directly. It's usually read as Adonai, my Lord, which is why it appears in English, Lord. So Moses reminds the people that he's interceded for them in the past, and he, while doing so, makes sure to flatter the Hebrew God. After all, he says, you've done all these wonderful things with the Yad Chazakah, with this mighty hand. Asher mi el bashamayim uva'aretz, asher ya'aseh kama'asecha. What other God? Is there any other God in the heaven or the earth that can do like what you did? So there's no one like you. Among the gods, well, you see, this is alluding to this transition period of one God and many gods. After all, when you say the word God in Hebrew, it's a plural. Elohim has an im ending, which is usually a plural. So maybe it means the gods or the divine force. as a collective plural something. But in this passage, we'll see a number of cases where it's beginning to assert a different kind of belief in Yahweh as not only one of many gods, but as something more than that. In fact, scholars present this evolution of belief not as going directly from polytheism to monotheism in one fell swoop. It rather is an evolution where first you have many gods, and then you have one god more important than all the other gods. Think of a Zeus as a king god. And if your God is the king god, then why would you bother dealing with the other ones? You'd only want to talk to the king, the head man in charge, so to speak. So that's called henotheism, where one God's more important than all the others. Well, now, if one God is more important than all the others, then why are you even worshiping these other gods? Why waste your time? Don't talk to the third undersecretary of the vice president in charge. Go to the CEO. So this is a stage called monolatry, where you're, again, like idolatry is worshiping idols. Monolatry is worshiping only one God. And then once you have a henotheistic system with one God more important than all the others, and a monolatrous system with only being allowed to worship one God, then the step to monotheism is a much shorter leap. And we'll see that being reflected in our sources through these chapters. Now, after this flattery, Moses does have a request. It's a good strategy, by the way. It works with people too. You flatter them first, and then you ask for something. And so Moses asks, let me cross over and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan. That is, he's speaking on the east bank, or what is today the kingdom of Jordan, looking to cross over into what is called the west bank, or the other side of the Jordan, the promised land. But Yahweh was wrathful he was angry with me because of you, Moses says to the people. And Moses has a bit of anger here that comes out a few times. He would not listen to me. He said, enough. Never speak to me about this again. Go to the top of Pisgah, gaze about to the west, the north, and south. Look at it, but you don't get to cross. Give Joshua the instruction, let him do it, and he will give out the land that you can only see. So Moses, after all of his years of service, doesn't get the ultimate reward to enter the promised land. He is, in fact, left outside of the land. And the role of Moses in Deuteronomy is really fascinating because Moses, you'll remember, is the preeminent prophet. It says at the end of Deuteronomy, there was no prophet like him before or since. But Moses, in this case, thinking historically, is really a pawn in a battle between priests and prophets of the 700s, of the 800s BCE, where the prophets claimed to get direct visions from God. And the priests claimed that they had written versions of what God wanted them to do. And the way the priests made their master stroke during that exile in Babylon, when they were compiling the Torah, was to say that the best prophet ever gave us a book. And so we don't need any prophets now because we have the prophecy of the best prophet ever written in this Torah, in this teaching that he's given us. So Moses not entering the land is one of the ways of saying that he did it in exile and that was okay, but also that prophecy's over. We don't need prophecy when we get into the land because the prophet is gone. In fact, we don't even know where Moses is buried, according to the end of Deuteronomy. Now, as we enter chapter 4, we get a flavor for the rhetorical style of Deuteronomy, which is what Sherwin Wine always called hortatory. It's, oh, listen here. It's like a Shakespeare oratory, you know. In fact, you see in the very first verse here of chapter 4, that idea of listen, Shema. In fact, there are multiple Shema passages here, not just the Shema we're used to from the traditional prayer book. So it says in the first verse, V'ata Yisrael Shema et hachukim ve'et hamishpatim asher anochi melamed etchem la'asot. Listen, O Israel, and now Israel, listen, Shema, to the laws and the judgments that I am teaching you to do. Why? Leman techiyu uvatem, v'yirashtem et haaretz asher Yahweh Elohei avotechem noten lachem. So why follow these laws? So that you will live, you will enter and occupy and inherit the land that Yahweh, the God of your fathers, is giving you. So there's three pieces here. You will live if you follow these rules. You will get to stay on the land and inherit it and pass it down. And this is the God of your fathers, your ancestors, who has done this for you. You'll see those three pieces of rationale showing up multiple times for why follow these laws. And you'll see some of them are an appeal to good laws, and some of them are an appeal to do what you're told because God said so. But very clearly, you get a very common statement in the Torah: you shall not add anything to what I command to you or take anything away from it. Keep the commandments that I command to you. And you hear mitzvah, mitzvah, commandment, commandment, commandment. That's the verb, to command. In fact, the modern Hebrew army has the same root. The tzava is the army in modern Israel. So you're not allowed to add to or take away from those laws. There's not even a constitutional version of amendments here. So how do you respond to new circumstances? How do you respond to contradictions within the laws? What if it says one thing in one place and one thing somewhere else? As the famous example presents, what if you're supposed to honor your mother and father, but they're thieves? Or the Euthyphro case, honor your parents, stop murderers. Well, the rabbis are not without resource. They cannot add to this law, they cannot take away from this law in the words of the Torah scroll, but they can interpret. If you know anything about how the Supreme Court has worked in the last 240 years of this republic, we know that interpretation sometimes is as important as the ability to write the laws. So even if you cannot add to or take away from the written text, you can interpret it, and that can make all the difference. So in verse 3, again, we have some of the rationale. Why do these laws? You saw with your own eyes what Yahweh did in the battle of Baal Peor, where he wiped out from among you every person who followed them, and those who held fast to Yahweh are alive. Live by them. I've given you these laws and rules that Yahweh has commanded me for you to stay in the land you're about to enter and occupy. Observe them faithfully. Follow these laws carefully. That will be proof of your wisdom and your discernment to other people. So the reputation is an important factor here too. But the other people will hear these laws, and they will say to themselves, Rak am chacham v'navon, only a wise and understanding people. Hagoy hagadol hazeh, how wonderful is this nation? By the way, I'll point out in Hebrew, goy doesn't mean non-Jew, it just means nation. And here it's the Israelites being talked to as the goy, as the nation. But the other people will hear these laws and say, wow, these people are brilliant. What wonderful laws they have. So here we get a sense that the laws are good because they're good, not simply because the God has said so. But verse 7 goes back to the God rationale. For what great nation is there that has a God so close at hand as is Yahweh? Or the other side, what great nation has laws and rules, as it says, the translation is perfect, but the Hebrew is tzadikim, righteous, ideal. Kechol haTorah hazot, as all of this teaching, this Torah that I'm giving to you today. So there are two reasons why you follow these laws. God is powerful and so close at hand and does wonderful things, and these laws are wonderful. So it's having your Euthyphro and eating it. I mean, it's seeing both sides of the argument. It's claiming that both are simultaneously true. But, verse 9, take care. Watch yourself scrupulously. Do not forget what you saw with your eyes, and make them known. Teach them. V'hodatam levanecha ulevnei vanecha. Teach them to your children and to your children's children. This is actually a recently discovered mitzvah you'll hear about in some Jewish sources. You're supposed to not only teach your children, but teach your grandchildren, your children's children. So if you are an active part of your grandchildren's Jewish experience, it's in the Torah. So you have justification if your kids think you're being too meddly as a grandparent. You can, if it works for them, you can try and use this line. And so it reminds the people, you stood at before the God at the holy mountain. We'll talk about the name of the mountain in a bit. You came forward and stood, it says, at the foot of the mountain in English, but in Hebrew it actually says, V'ta'amdun tachat hahar, you stood under the mountain. There's actually a rabbinic interpretation that speculates where it says under the mountain, it means that God picked up the mountain and hung it over the people and threatened to drop it on them until they agreed to the covenant. What kind of a covenant, what kind of a deal is that? Extortion, coercion. Or maybe it's a parent who is telling the kid what's good for them. Sign this document, it's good for you. Well, still patronizing, but less offensive than the kind of mafia coercion style, which is another reading of that reading of Under the Mountain. Yahweh spoke to you out of the fire. Now notice this in verse 12. You heard the sound of words, but saw no shape, nothing but a voice. It's very, very definitive, declarative. No shape, no form, just a voice. Now, why that emphasis? Here's where the historical context is important. Remember the anti-idolatry, the anti-worshiping many gods that Josiah was trying to enact by smashing those feminine fertility goddesses? The rejection of forms of statuary for gods is a key part of this historical moment in the evolution of Jewish thought. And so that's why it says very clearly in this passage, no shape, no form, just a voice. Although there are plenty of passages in the book of Exodus and other places where you see God's feet. Moses sees God's back. We'll even see a passage today that talks about seeing God face to face. And so Moses reminds the people, if they had forgotten, that he declared a covenant with 10 commandments to observe. Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words. And we were commanded to impart laws to observe in the land you will cross into. For your own sake, therefore, verse 15, be most careful, since you saw no shape when he spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Again, that emphasis, no idols. Do not act wickedly and make yourself a sculptured image in any likeness whatsoever. Now again, wickedly? Is it really wicked to do this? Is it evil in a moral sense? Well, it depends on how you define morality. If morality is violating the purity laws, then yes, it's immoral. If you define morality as the consequences for helping or hurting people, then maybe it's not. But if it's defined, if morality is defined as what the God says to do or not to do, then clearly it's immoral because the God said, don't do it. In any form, man or woman, any beast on earth, any winged bird, anything that creeps on the ground, even the stars in the sky and the sun and the moon, don't bow to them. Other peoples are allowed to bow to them. Yahweh allotted them to them. So again, this is the king God assigning the gods to other nations. But you, Yahweh took out of Egypt to be his own people, as is now the case. Now here you get Moses' anger coming out again. Yahweh was angry with me on your account because of you people. And it swore I should not cross the Jordan. He just said it last chapter, but he's reminding them. I must die in this land. I will not cross the Jordan, but you get to cross. You take possession of that good land. So if I'm not going to be with you, be careful. Hishmeru lachem. Be careful yourselves. Do not forget the covenant that Yahweh has made with you. Do not make yourself an image or a likeness, because in verse 24, God is a consuming fire who Elkanah. He is a jealous God, an impassioned God. And that question of a jealous God always, in my mind, raises the issue of jealous of what? I mean, if there are no other gods, if this is a purely monotheistic document, as many religions believe, who is he jealous of? What is he jealous of? If there are other gods that could legitimately distract you, then okay, I'd be jealous. But it seems odd to be jealous of nothingness, of vanity, of emptiness. But in this case, he is a jealous God who doesn't even want you to think about other gods. Even if there are no other gods, don't even think about them. Don't look at them. When you've begotten children and children's children and are long established, should you act wickedly and make for yourselves a sculptured image? Here's the kicker. If you do break these laws that Moses supposedly is giving you a long time ago, what will happen? You will soon perish from the land you are crossing to possess. You will not long endure in it. You will be wiped out. Yahweh will scatter you among the peoples, and a scant few shall be left among the nations. There you will serve man-made gods of wood and stone. They cannot do anything. But if you search there for Yahweh, you will find him. If you seek him with all your heart and soul in distress, you return to him and obey him. He's a compassionate God. He will not forget the covenant he made with your fathers. All right. So this is what's called a theodicy. It's explaining why a terrible thing happened. The terrible thing was Judean territory was destroyed, whether it was the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern land of Judah. Hebrews were exiled. Why? They broke the rules. They worshiped idols. How can they possibly come back? Stop it. And the compassion will intervene. So this is an argument that's percolating to explain why this disaster happened. If Yahweh is the most important God of all, why would he allow his people to be destroyed and exiled? Now, verse 31 goes on to explain that you don't have to worry. Verse 32 goes on to explain you don't have to doubt that this is true. All you have to do, sha'alna liyamim rishonim, ask back to the first days, the bygone ages before you. Has anything as grand as this ever happened? Has its like ever been known? Has any people ever heard the voice of a God speaking out of a fire as you have and survived? Or has any God ventured to go and take for himself one nation by a prodigious acts, by signs and portents, by war, by a mighty and outstretched arm and awesome power as happened to you in Egypt? You saw it, and seeing is believing. Now, later generations will point back to this kind of a text to say, of course, the Bible is true. Are you saying your grandparents lied to you? Because their grandparents told them, and their grandparents told them, and their grandparents told them, and you think somebody just made it up? And then everyone believed it? This is an argument presented in a Jewish philosophical work from around the year 1100 called the Kuzari. And it's basically saying, don't you trust your grandparents? Of course, our answer to all these questions of, do I believe everything my grandparents told me, is no. I don't think they were perfect. I don't think they knew everything. And yes, mistaken ideas get propagated. Legends are told. People believe things, especially when they come from well-respected authorities. So has any people heard the voice of a God speaking out of fire? No. Has any God ventured and done these things? No. Now here's the transition point from this polytheist to henotheist to monolatry. Now we have a clear statement of one God in verse 35. It has clearly been shown to you that Yahweh is God. Ki Yahweh hu ha-Elohim. Yahweh is the gods. He's divinity. Ein od milvado. There is no other beside him. That's it. Nothing. No Baal, no Chemosh, no Asherah. That's it. He is the God. Now, in polytheistic systems, you would often have a system called syncretism, where you'd say, well, you have Zeus and I have my king God, and we sort of call them by different names. But here we have an attempt to make Yahweh the equivalent of all the gods at once. Not only the sky god El and the Canaanite pantheon, but all the Elohim, all the gods that are there. And again, it's repeated in verse 39, the same thing. Know therefore on this day, keep in mind that Yahweh alone, ki Yahweh hu ha-Elohim, he is the God, he is the only God. In the sky above and in the earth below, ein od, again, there is no other. Observe these laws, you get the theme here? Observe these laws and commandments, so it will go well with your children, and you'll remain long in the land. So there is a consequentialist approach here. If you follow the laws, you won't suffer. Not necessarily because the laws are wonderful, but because God will punish you. But there is some kind of consequence that's threatened here. And then Moses sets aside 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan. This is for the manslayer, for someone who kills without intending it. In fact, the Hebrew is really interesting. It says, Shama there, Rotseach asher yirtzach, a murderer who murders, et rehu bilti dat, who kills his neighbor without knowing or unintentionally, v'hu lo sonelo, and he didn't hate him, mitmol shilshom, from the day before that. So if you had a grudge against him, it's not plausible that you killed him by accident. But if you were not known to have hated him for multiple days and you just accidentally kill him, there's a place you can flee to avoid the blood feud. So this would be an argument of legality and morality intersecting. where it's true, a manslaughter shouldn't be treated like a murderer, and so making a distinction is valuable. So before we go on to our next chapter, I do want to stop for a moment and ask if you have any questions or comments on the passages that we've seen so far before we dive into the versions of the Shema and Ten Commandments as well.
Is the interpretation of this that God is saying there never were all these other gods, and I'm just making it official today? Or there used to be, but I got rid of them. They're no longer.
I think the sense is there are no others at this point. I don't know if it's getting into a there weren't or I wiped them out. I don't think he fired them. I mean, it's not like a downsizing in this version of the story. I mean, my point is, if you read other passages in the Hebrew Bible, it very clearly is a polytheistic system. In the story of Noah, for example, the sons of God come down and have children with the daughters of men, and it's Greek style, polytheistic anarchy. But this passage is saying there's only this God. This is the only God there is. So the later generations and rabbinic interpreters for sure would argue, well, those earlier stories, people just misunderstood. They were misinterpreting. Maybe they were angels, maybe they were demons, maybe they were just, legends, but they weren't really gods. It was a mistake. It was an error. But this is a belief system that imagines that Adam was monotheistic and Noah was monotheistic and Abraham was monotheistic, and then it gradually sort of deteriorated and got corrupted over centuries. Whereas the historical approach suggests it was a polytheistic system that gradually evolved toward a more monotheistic approach. And this is some of the echoes of that process. This is an end point of that process. These passages in Deuteronomy are some of the most monotheistic that you'll find in the Torah. So that's one of the reasons why it's dated to later in that process, like 650 or even 550 BCE. It's very late in the process. Some of the earlier texts dated back to 1000 or 900 BCE, those reflect some of that more polytheistic flavor.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so let's pick it up with chapter 5, and we'll be going through just a little sliver of chapter 7, so we'll move along. So here we have, surprise, a Shema, but it's not the Shema you're used to. I'll try and sing it to the traditional melody. Shema Yisrael et hachukim ve'et hamishpatim asher anochi dover be'oznechem hayom u'lemadatem otam u'shmartem la'asotam. It doesn't work. I need a new melody for that. But the words in English you'll see are, "Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules I proclaim to you this day. Study them and observe them faithfully." But that's the rhetoric of Deuteronomy. It's listen, do. It's very hortatory, very oratory. Yahweh, our God, made a covenant with us at Horeb. Notice that they're calling this mountain Horeb, not Sinai. This is one of the quirks of Deuteronomy. It refers to the holy mountain as Horeb. Most interpreters, both academic and rabbinic, assume Horeb equals Sinai. It's just a different name. But why have a different name? Maybe it is a different mountain. Or as one medieval interpreter suggested, it was a mountain with two peaks. So one peak was Sinai and one peak was Horeb. It was not with our fathers, our ancestors, that Yahweh made this covenant, but with every one of us today. Now notice verse 4. Panim b'panim, face to face. Yahweh spoke to you. What? What happened to no image? Well, I think it means like person to person, direct communication. Moses says, I stood between you and Yahweh to convey his words. You were afraid of the fire. And here's what he said. And here we have the 10 Commandments restated from Exodus 20, again here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. But I hope you'll understand now why idolatry is so high on the list. Modern secular thinkers are kind of stumped. Well, you're listing the 10 most important rules and you're going to put idolatry as number 1 and no other gods before me and no sculptured images? Why is that the most important thing to say? Well, if it's Yahweh differentiating himself from the other cults, if it's the priests emphasizing no worshiping idols lest you be exiled from the land, now you understand why these are some of the first commandments. No other gods beside me, no sculptured image or idols. Do not bow down or serve them. I am a jealous God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, the 3rd and 4th generation, but showing kindness to the 1000th generation. So what happens if you've got generational switch where some are good and some are bad? It's not clear which takes precedence. the kindness or the guilt. And there's also other passages later in Deuteronomy, by the way, that even debate this passage and say, you know what? Nobody should be put to death for his father's sin. So it even disagrees with the Ten Commandments themselves. Do not swear falsely by the name of Yahweh your God. Observe the Sabbath day, the holy time, and keep it holy. 6 days you labor and work, the seventh day you rest. And you rest because you were slaves in Egypt and were delivered. This is the difference, by the way. In Exodus 20, you rest because of the 7 days of creation, which we know of from Genesis. Here, there's a different reason given, but it's the same commandment to rest. And honor your mother and father. Now, out of these initial commandments, how many of them are ritual and how many are ethical? Well, no idolatry, no false swearing, the Sabbath day. I mean, giving your workers a day off, that may be ethical. Honoring your parents. I mean, if you're a parent, you certainly think that's ethical. I don't know if the kids think that's ethical. Now we get the real ethical ones lumped in near the end. Don't murder. Oh, by the way, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness. Don't covet, don't be jealous of your neighbor. Now, these rules are thought to be rules for all time, rules for all places, universal ethics. That's why fundamentalists keep wanting to put it on the walls of courtrooms and public schoolhouses. But the reality is that some of these things are right and wrong just because the God said so, not because they're universal ethics. And some of them are universal ethics whether or not the God said so. Lots of cultures say, do not covet your neighbor's wife, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. You don't need Hebrew to get those in traditional sources. These rules were good, in my perspective, they were good before God said so, or before people said God said so. They're not good just because the God said so, and we'll see that definitely in chapter 7. So the people deputized Moses to hear the rest of the laws because they can't handle it. This fearsome fire will consume us, they say, and so they have to pull back. And so Yahweh agrees with this, and so everyone goes back to their tents except Moses stays with God, and he gets all the mitzvah, all the commandments, all the laws, all the judgments to pass along. So Moses reminds them, do not turn, lo tasuru yaminu small, do not turn to the right or the left, only follow the derech, only follow the one true path. In rabbinic Hebrew, this becomes known as the halacha, the law, which comes from halach, to walk. It's the path, just like the Tao, just like Sharia. It's the true path of the true believer. Do not turn to the right or to the left. It's get the sense of a very narrow direction. In fact, people who have left the Orthodox world, some of the people have been watching this terrible reality show called My Unorthodox Life. They call themselves off the derech. They're off the path because they've turned to the right or they've turned to the left. They've made different choices and in some ways chosen their own derech, their own path. And so here in chapter 6, we have that very famous passage of the Shema in verse 4. This is the commandment that's being given to you, the mitzvah, so that you and your children may revere Yahweh as long as you live and long endure. So it's have long life and love God by obeying the laws. Obey and willingly and faithfully to go well with you. You will increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as Yahweh spoke to you. Again, are they increasing and are they being successful because the laws are wonderful in and of themselves? Or are they being successful because they're following what God said and therefore he'll reward them? The sense in this passage is much more the second of those, even though later commentators try to emphasize the goodness of the laws, that one line we saw early on, because that's more respectable than just doing what God said so. And here we have in verse 4 that key line, Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, often translated. You'll notice in the Hebrew, by the way, 2 letters are larger than the other ones, an ayin and a daled, which spells out in Hebrew just those 2 letters, ed, which means witness. So that's sometimes thought as this is a statement of witnessing, a declaration of faith, like the Shahada in Islam. This is a Jewish version of that. And in a traditional synagogue, you wouldn't only read this one line. You would go on to read what's called the Ahafta, which is the very next session. You will love your Yahweh, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And so take all these instructions to heart, tell them to your children, recite them when you stay home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you get up. This should be familiar, if nothing else, from the poems we read by Primo Levi and Marcia Falk that are re-envisioning this, not to use these words of the Lord your God as the king, but rather to use words of justice, of truth, of suffering, of real memory and history. That's what they want you to teach to your children. In this case, though, it's these words, and indeed, not just to teach them to them, to say them when you lie down and get up, like a morning and evening Shema, but to tie them as a sign on your hand, be a symbol on your forehead. That's the tefillin, that's the mezuzah on the doorpost, to inscribe them on the doorpost, the mezuzot of your house and your gates. So the commandment is to take these words and to live by them, but also to repeat them and to remind yourself of them and to keep this covenant that was given to you, because after all, you're taking over a land full of good things you did not fill, and cisterns you did not hew, and vineyards you did not plant, it says in verse 11. You get to eat your fill because you've dispossessed all these people and taken over this territory. Do not forget Yahweh who freed you. Worship only Yahweh. Worship him alone. Only swear by his name. So again, you get this monolatry. Only worship this God. Lo telchun achrei Elohim acherim. Do not follow other gods. Mi Elohei ha'amim asher tzvivotechem. Any of the gods of the peoples who are around you. Because Yahweh your God is an impassioned, again, a jealous God. He will blaze forth against you and wipe you from the face of the earth. Do not test him as you did at Massah. Keep the commandments that he's given to you. Verse 18 really has the key line of this Euthyphro question. Is it good because God said so, or because the laws are good in and of themselves? Vasita hayashar v'hatov be'enei Yahweh. Do what is right and good in the sight of Yahweh, in the sight of the Lord in this translation. So it will go well with you and you'll be able to possess the land. So do what is right and good in Yahweh's eyes. So that can include justice for the widow and the orphan, and letting your slaves rest on the seventh day, and honoring your mother and father. But it also includes ritual laws and practices, dietary laws and practices, no idolatry, things that we would consider in the category of personal choice or who cares. But if it's wrong in the eyes of Yahweh, then it is wrong, period, end of story. And verse 20 has an interesting echo in later Jewish life. In time to come, your children ask you, what do these laws and rules and decrees all mean that Yahweh gave to you? This question, by the way, is repeated verbatim in the Passover Haggadah. Remember, there are 4 sons or 4 children. The simple who can't ask a question. One who just says, Mazeh, what's this? One of them says, what is this festival? And then this is the detailed question the wise son asks. The Chacham asks this long question, quoted verbatim from Deuteronomy chapter 6. You know, we sometimes forget how much of the prayer book and the Haggadah are simply quotations from the Bible, just like the Shema isn't a prayer composed by rabbis, it's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 to 9, which is the Shema plus the Ahafta passage we just saw. Now, when we get to chapter 7, here's where, again, that question of legal and moral becomes much more muddied. When Yahweh, your God, brings you to the land you're about to enter and possess, and he dislodges, he moves out the peoples that were there before you. Now, in this case, they're not named Iroquois and Cherokee and Apache as they were in America when they were dispossessed, or other examples of native peoples that have been dispossessed by people moving in. In this case, they're names of people in the area: Hittites, Girgashites, Canaanites, Hivites, Jebusites, etc. Nations much larger than you, they're going to be dispossessed. You are going to take over the land, but they might not all go away. Or maybe you should make sure they do. Yahweh your God delivers them to you, you defeat them, doom them to destruction. The hacharem tacharim, you will cherem them for sure. And cherem is wipe out, prescribe, totally destroy, salt the earth. No terms, no quarter. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or give their son, take your daughters for your sons, take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. He will wipe you out if you do that. This is what you do. You tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their posts, consign their images to the fire. You are a holy people. You're consecrated. You're made holy, kadosh, and am kadosh. You are a holy people made separate, distinct, set apart for your God. He chose you, Bacha Bachar. In you he chose. Liot lo la'am segula, a people fenced off, set apart, treasured. to be different from everybody else. Mikol ha'amim asher al pnei ha'adamah. From all the nations that are in the face of the earth, you are separate, distinct, and different. Stay away from everybody else. Indeed, wipe them out if you have to. You were chosen because he made an oath to your fathers, and he saved you from bondage, and so he keeps his covenants. But he instantly requites with destruction those who reject him. Observe faithfully the laws I convey to you this day. Now, is this ethical? No. Is it good because the God said so? Well, this is the justification for a holy war. It's a jihad. The only consolation in this passage is that it's probably a jihad that never happened. These are later generations saying, if only we had wiped out those peoples, they wouldn't have led us astray, we wouldn't have married their daughters, we wouldn't have been led astray and worshiping other gods, and we'd still be in the land happy and hunky-dory. But because we didn't follow what Moses told us to do, this is what happened. Now, when we look back at this, of course, we know that Moses' prophecy is what we call a post-dated prophecy. It's a prophecy that was written later to explain what happened in between. And it claims, if only we'd done what we always knew we should do. This isn't how real life works. We don't get to make choices that way. And we also, living on the other side of the secular revolution, are much more skeptical of people who claim to have the will of God written in a book or speaking to them in their ear. We'd much rather check it against evidence in the real world and the evidence of our own senses, of our own moral senses. If the God says wipe them out, we should say no. If the God says take your son, your only son, the one you love, to sacrifice him on a mountain, we should say no. If the tradition says to reject people of other backgrounds, do not marry them and do not let them into your life, and your child falls in love with one of them, we should say yes to love and no to saying no. These are our ethics and values today. They're very different from the values of the past. Some of them are consonant. We find plenty of other passages like the city for manslaughter, like the caring for the widow and the orphan, like rejecting murder and stealing and all the things the Ten Commandments tell us not to do. We agree. You shouldn't do many of those. Avoid those ethical flaws. Don't commit those transgressions. I'm coming to you live on an electronic device on Shabbat. I'm breaking that rule. Does it make me a bad person? I don't even think it makes me a bad Jew, because they don't get to define for me what being good is all about.